Chapter 4, Essence of the Gita, the core of the teaching. So last time we read chapter 3, the human disciple, and before that, of course, the divine teacher. So now this chapter really is a very important chapter because here we get to understand um, how to interpret the Gita. And Sri Aurobindo's very um, unique and integral way of looking at the Gita. I think this is it's an extremely important chapter because it also uh, sort of shatters a few of the misinterpretations of the Gita that have been prevailing over the years, which actually a lot of us have been hearing. So, you will find that it is quite a revolutionary chapter because it sets forth the Gita in its own time rather than in our time. The core of the teaching. We know the divine teacher. We see the human disciple. It remains to form a clear conception of the doctrine. A clear conception. So now, here Sri Aurobindo is mentioning, we know the divine teacher as we read in the first, chapter second, and we know the human disciple, which we just read last time. And now he says what we need to do is to form a clear conception of the doctrine of the Gita. A clear conception fastening upon the essential idea, the central heart of the teaching, is especially necessary here because the Gita, with its rich and many sided thought, its synthetical grasp of different aspects of the spiritual life, and the fluent winding motion of its argument, lends itself even more than other scriptures to one sided misrepresentations. Please note that. Born of a partisan intellectuality. Because of the many-sided thought, the synthetical grasp, the different aspects of the spiritual life that the Gita captures, it is very much given to a one-sided misrepresentation born of a partisan intellectuality. The unconscious or half-conscious wresting of fact and word and idea to suit a preconceived notion or the doctrine or principle of one's preference is recognized by Indian logicians as one of the most fruitful sources of fallacy. So, I think that's quite clear. The idea that half conscious or unconscious wresting of fact and word and idea to suit a preconceived notion or a doctrine or principle of one's own preference is recognized by Indian logicians as one of the most fruitful sources of fallacy. Fallacy means of misinterpretation, of false understanding, of fallacy. And it is perhaps the one which is the most difficult for even the most conscientious thinker to avoid. But the human reason is incapable of always playing the detective upon itself in this respect. So this is a very, very interesting human psychological point that Sri Aurobindo mentions here. We find that our human reason is incapable of playing detective upon itself in this respect of avoiding this uh, tendency to interpret a text according to the one way one own ideas and one's own conceptions. That's what he's saying, right? So, for the human reason is incapable of always playing the detective upon itself in this respect. It is its very nature to seize upon some partial conclusion, idea, principle, become its partisan, and make it the key to all truth. And it has an infinite faculty of doubling upon itself so as to avoid detecting in its operations this necessary and cherished weakness. The Gita lends itself easily to this kind of error because it is easy, by throwing particular emphasis on one of its aspects, or even on some salient and emphatic text, and putting all the rest of the 18 chapters into the background, or making them a subordinate and auxiliary teaching, to turn it into a partisan of our own doctrine or dogma. Now, this is extremely important because there are so many interpretations of the Gita that we have read and heard of, and one that is most uppermost in our minds is the idea of the Gita being a gospel of social duty or of familial duty, of the idea of duty to the family, duty to the country, duty to the. And there are so many expositions about, dharma and how it's interpreted. Now, yeah, and how, one works for the higher good of the family and the higher good of the community and higher good of the society and so on. And I'm sure you know all the writers who've written like that on the Gita. Now, Sri Aurobindo here is very particularly uh, clear that that is not it's a partial interpretation, and it is because of the times that we're living in. You see, our times are very modern times, modern man and modern mind, very prone to the idea of social uh, and community welfare, duty, family, and the idea of work as action is very important. So, Gita is seen as all of that and not as, you know, something what Sri Aurobindo is trying to bring out in this chapter, which is that it is all three things: knowledge, works, and bhakti, devotion. These three, it's a synthetical thing, it's not one or the other. Yes, and the spirit, yeah, that comes into the spiritual. So, the Gita lends itself easily to this kind of error because it is easy and to put a particular emphasis. Thus, there are those who make the Gita teach not works at all, but a discipline of preparation for renouncing life and works. So, you read the Gita to attain moksha. There are all interpretations like that. The indifferent, and this idea of indifference, and so many times I've received this question: how do you become indifferent to action? How do you become indifferent to the results of one's actions? So these are questions that emanate from this thought process that the world is an illusion and is mithya, and our real thing is to escape the whole round of works. So read this. These are very, very important core ideas. And if you can get a fixation on this and understanding of this, the rest of the Gita then becomes much more easier to understand. Thus, there are those who make Gita teach not works at all, but a discipline of preparation for renouncing life and works. The indifferent performance of prescribed actions or of whatever task may lie ready to the hands becomes the means, the discipline, the final renunciation of life and works is the sole real object. It is quite easy to justify this view by citation from the book and by a certain arrangement of stress in following out its argument, especially if we shut our eyes to the peculiar way in which it uses such a word as sannyas, renunciation. But it is quite impossible to persist in this view on an impartial reading in face of the continual assertion to the very end that action should be preferred to inaction. Till the very end, the Gita talks about that action should be preferred to inaction, and that superiority lies with the true the inner renunciation of desire by equality and the giving up of work to the Supreme Purusha. So this inner renunciation, as, as opposed to the way that it's normally interpreted as outer renunciation, is one of the difficulties. The second, of course, is the fact that action is always preferred to inaction. Others again speak of the Gita as if the doctrine of devotion were its whole teaching, and put in the background its monistic elements and the high place it gives to quietistic emergence in the one self of all. And undoubtedly, its emphasis on devotion, its insistence on the aspect of the divine as Lord and Purusha, and its doctrine of the Purushottama, the Supreme Being, who is superior both to the mutable being and to the immutable, and who is what in his relation to the world we know as God, are the most striking and among the most vital elements of the Gita. Still, this Lord is the self in whom all knowledge culminates, and the master of sacrifice, to whom all works lead, as well as the Lord of love, into whose being the heart of devotion enters. And the Gita preserves a perfectly equal balance, emphasizing now knowledge, now works, now devotion, but for the purposes of the immediate trend of the thought, not with any absolute separate preference of one over the others. He in whom all three meet and become one, he is the supreme being, the Purushottama. So here again, Sri Aurobindo is pointing out that there is a tendency of either making the Gita into a doctrine of devotion or a doctrine of movement to outside of the world, giving up. However, he says the Gita is all these three. And at each moment of the Gita, one aspect is emphasized so that each of these three aspects are taken into consideration. But for what purpose? The ultimate purpose is to reside in the Supreme Being, to become one with the Supreme Self, and to have that inner poise of divinity. So, um, is that clear? Any questions? Clear? Quite clear? Hmm. Okay. But if there are, just keep them. We'll take them up later. Still, this Lord is a self in whom all knowledge culminates, and the master of sacrifice to whom all works lead, and the Lord of love into whose being the heart of devotion enters. And then in the end, he in whom all three meet and become one, he is the supreme being, the Purushottama. But at the present day, since in fact the modern mind began to recognize and deal at all with the Gita, the tendency is to subordinate its elements of knowledge and devotion, to take advantage of its continual insistence on action, and to find in it a scripture of the Karma Yoga, a light leading us on the path of action, a gospel of works. So, this is, of course, a very present day modern um, phenomena where today, in the modern world, uh, 19th, 20th, 21st century, we are very focused on the outer world, the inner worlds and the inner tapasya of the Vedic ages and then of the other ages where the spiritual life was given far more importance, has now become subservient to the material life. Yeah. The use of the word works. Works is the English way of saying karma, all work. Works, why he says works is any work, not just, you know, a profession, but all actions, yeah, in every field. So, the modern in the modern mind, the tendency is to subordinate its elements of knowledge, devotion, and to take advantage of its continual insistence on action and to find in it a scripture of the Karma Yoga, a light leading us on the path of action, a gospel of works. Undoubtedly, the Gita is a gospel of work, which is, of course, it is. He's not denying that it isn't, but of works which culminate in knowledge. That is, and what kind of knowledge is this? Not our ordinary knowledge. That is in spiritual realization. So the knowledge leading to spiritual realization and quietude, and of works motived by devotion. That is a conscious surrender of one's whole self, first into the hands and then into the being of the Supreme. And not at all of works as they are understood by the modern mind. Not at all an action dictated by egoistic and altruistic, by personal, social, humanitarian motives, principles, ideals. Now we need to pause here. It is extremely, extremely important here. So has this quite, have you understood this? I mean, this particular point about what kind of works um, and how that the Gita is talking about. What is the difference between the works the Gita is speaking about and the Karma Yoga gospel of works? And what is the way that we interpret action and works? We normally say that it's related to ourselves. It's related, we think it's a very high ideal if we do things not for ourselves but for the other altruism, or even higher, the humanitarian causes, the social causes, the principles, high ideals, principles. But the Gita is not on the ethical plane. The Gita goes one step beyond and says this works or this work that you do is not yoga, is not karma yoga unless you're doing it for as an offering to the divine and as a surrender of your whole being to the divine, as a um, um, to gain spiritual knowledge and um, um, realization. So this wisdom that equality that comes is not a mental equality. It is not an indifference or a you know, uh, how do I say it? These are also stages that one goes through. The law of graduality takes place, in all things. But it's not like you detach yourself and become indifferent by not by deadening your senses, by deadening your nature, by deadening your character. But you actually become full and you grow in consciousness and you are fruitful because you have surmounted that human nature and that mental nature and given yourself in surrender to the highest divine. So what actually happens to you instead of uh, contracting in your consciousness, there is an expansion of consciousness, and there is an inner joy that flows through the being, through the nerves, through the veins, a bliss, a sense that you can feel the divine bliss, the divine consciousness, because you no longer see or your actions only as your egoistic personal property, but as actions emanating from a higher, deeper, divine source. And then the way to do it, of course, the whole of Gita. Read it again. Hmm. Yes, you're still embedded in the ego when you're doing altruistic work. Hmm. Yes, and you're able to see his. We can get to, yes. And that fluidity is also related to the idea that you become not the, you don't become the owner of the works, you become a servant and you become a, you can feel the divine action working through you, and your ego then becomes submerged or sublimated in the divine. And the egoism then disappears. Otherwise, altruism is always, if you see the ego of the altruists and the humanitarian, always a sense of the, privilege that I have done this for the world, or for humanity or for social society or whatever. Hmm. So this is interesting because most of the Gita is interpreted in this way, most of the times. Okay. Now, undoubtedly, the Gita is a gospel of work, but of works which culminate in knowledge, that is, in spiritual realization and quietude, and of works motived by devotion, that is, the conscious surrender of one's whole self, first into the hands and then into the being of the Supreme, and not at all of works as they are understood by the modern mind. Not at all an action dictated by egoistic and altruistic, by personal, social, humanitarian motives, principles, ideals. Yet, this is what present day interpretations seek to make of the Gita. We are told continually by many authoritative voices that the Gita, opposing in this the ordinary ascetic and quietistic tendency of Indian thought and spirituality, proclaims with no uncertain sound the gospel of human action, the ideal of disinterested performance of social duties. Nay, even, it would seem, the quite modern ideal of social service. Very important because this is how he's saying even some of the greatest voices and the most authoritative commentaries on the Gita are dwelling on this idea of the gospel of human action and the ideal of disinterested performance of social duties and uh, and the quite modern ideal of social service. To all this, I can only reply that very patently and even on the very surface of it, the Gita does nothing of the kind. And this is a modern misreading, a reading of the modern mind into an ancient book. I think this is extremely important. You don't have a book. If you want, you can pick up one from the library. Okay, you're okay. All right. So, um, a reading of the modern mind into an ancient book. This is very important. The Gita does nothing of the kind, and that this is a modern misreading, a reading of the modern mind into an ancient book of the present day European or Europeanized intellect into a thoroughly antique, a thoroughly Oriental and Indian teaching. So this is extremely important. I cannot emphasize this particular line of this chapter. Because unless this sinks into your consciousness and we begin to understand the times and the Indian ethos and culture, which uh, has obviously our minds have in some sense become Europeanized, and especially this age of the materialization and the material importance of material life has got such a dominance in this Kali Yuga, in this particular age, that the other yugas in which the Dwapar Yuga, when the Gita was written, that age and that times is something that we need to understand. And this is something we need to bring back into balance so that there is an integration of all. And that is why the Gita has such a great importance. So, to all this, I can only reply that very patently, and even on the very surface of it, the Gita does nothing of the kind, and that this is a modern misreading, a reading of the modern mind into an ancient book of the present day European or Europeanized intellect, into a thoroughly antique, thoroughly Oriental, and Indian teaching. That which the Gita teaches is not a human, but a divine action. So all this time we're talking about action and works. All the interpretations are talking about human actions and human works for society, for family, for the world, for community. And while all of this is important, not to be relegated or deemed unimportant, but the Gita is not written like for this. This is talking about not a human action, but a divine action. That which the Gita teaches is not a human, but a divine action, not the performance of social duties, but the abandonment of all other standards of duty or conduct for a selfless performance of the divine will working through our nature, not social service, but the action of the best, the God possessed, the master men, done impersonally for the sake of the world and as a sacrifice to Him who stands behind man and nature. In other words, the Gita is not a book of practical ethics, but of the spiritual life. Now, if, if this is that, then this is when you read interpretations of the Gita, this is very important way you can see that what is the interpretation stressing on. In other words, the Gita is not a book of practical ethics, but of the spiritual life. The modern mind is just now the European mind, just as it has become after having abandoned not only the philosophic idealism of the highest Greco-Roman culture from which it started, but the Christian devotionalism of the Middle Ages. These two things, the philosophical idealism and the devotionalism of the Middle Ages, has been replaced by or transmuted into a practical idealism and social, patriotic, and philanthropic devotion. It has got rid of God or kept him only for Sundays. It has got rid of God, kept him only for Sunday use, and erected in his place, man as its deity and society as its visible idol. So this is the how, sorry? This is how the modern, this is what he's saying, that look, the modern mind is now mostly the European mind. And even the European mind has abandoned its roots of the highest Greco-Roman culture from which it started and the Christian devotionalism of the Middle Ages and replaced it or transmuted it into a practical idealism and social, patriotic, and philanthropic devotion. It has got rid of God, kept him only for Sunday use, and erected in his place as its deity and society, erected in his place man as its deity and society as its visible idol. At its best, it is practical, at its best. Practical, ethical, social, pragmatic, altruistic, humanitarian. Now, all these things are good, are especially needed at the present day. So here you see this wonderful, uh, way that Sri Aurobindo puts everything in its correct place. It is not that it is not required. Very, very important, especially now. All these things are good and especially needed in the present day, are part of the divine will, note, or they would not have become so dominant in humanity. So they're necessary for the evolutionary progress of the world, nature, and of humanity. Nor is there any reason why the divine man, the man who lives in the Brahmic consciousness, in the God being, should not be all these things in his action. He will be. Neither are these one or the other. There is no opposition there either. A divine man or a man poised in the Brahmic consciousness necessarily will have these qualities. He will be altruistic. He will have a certain he will be sensitive to all creatures. He'll have humanitarian virtues. He will be ethical. He will be practical. He will be socially conscious. However, it is more than that that the Gita pushes us towards. So now all these things are good. Nor is there any reason why the divine man, the man who lives in the Brahmic consciousness, in the God being, should not be all these things in his action. He will be, if they are the best ideal of the age, the Yuga Dharma. And there is no yet higher ideal to be established, no great radical change to be effected. For he is, as the teacher points out to his disciple, the best who has to set the standard for others. And in fact, Arjuna is called upon to live according to the highest ideals of his age and the prevailing culture, but with knowledge, with understanding of that which lay behind, and not as ordinary men with a following of the merely outward law and rule. But the point here is that the modern mind has exiled from its practical motive power the two essential things, God or the eternal, and spirituality or the God state. So these have been, the point here is that the modern mind has exiled from its practical motive power, not otherwise. We talk about it, but from its practical motive, and please note the word motive power. That means practical in its actions, in its works. So has exiled from its practical motive power the two essential things, God or the eternal, and spirituality or the God state, which are the master conceptions of the Gita. It lives in humanity only. What lives in humanity only? The modern mind. It lives in humanity only. And the Gita would have us live in God. Though for the world in God. Though for the world in God. Not that you escape the world. Though for the world in God. In its life, heart, and intellect only. And the Gita would have us live in the spirit, in the mutable being, who is all creatures. And the Gita would have us live only in the immutable and the supreme, in the changing march of time. And the Gita would have us live in the eternal. So it lives in humanity only, and the Gita would have us live in God. That's the first thing. Though for the world in God. In its life, heart, and intellect only, is the modern mind would have us live in the life, in the vital being, in the heart, in the sensational being, and in the mind. How? But the Gita would have us live in the spirit also, not to ignore the spirit, the God state. So, in the modern mind, would have us live in the mutable being, who is all creatures. But the Gita would also have us live in the immutable and the supreme, in the changing march of time. And the Gita would have us live in the eternal. So these are the juxtapositions. or if these things are now beginning to be vaguely envisaged, it is only to make them subservient to man and society. And he says, even if these things now are coming into vogue, are being envisaged as ideals, you know, it is still at the subservient, still at the service of man and society. It is only to make them subservient to man and society. But God and spirituality exist in their own right and not as adjuncts. And in practice, the lower in us must learn to exist for the higher. So, in practice, in action, in our life, the lower in us, the lower ideals, must learn to exist for the higher ideals, in order that the higher also may, in us, consciously exist for the lower. So, how does the higher exist for the lower? Unless the lower is picked up by the higher, then the higher also exists for the lower. Yes. Yes, it could be every way. Yes. Yes.
So can one say that while hearing this one to higher consciousness, there's no emphasis on reality, is there? I mean,
No. So there is no.
also exactly. I mean, if you ask to do this, to engage with the world, but with a higher order, but not to be there and be there.
Yeah, there is no renunciation or self-deprecation, as you have pointed out, but the renunciation is there of attachment and desire, but that's an inner renunciation. In the outward life, nobody would know whether you are actually doing that or not. You know, you would appear like a normal human being, but certainly it is a gospel of fullness, of wholeness, of completeness, of embracing the world, but with the ultimate aim of understanding that your ego is not the doer, that you are based and situated in an ego consciousness which is very limiting. And the moment you can come out of that, your consciousness expands into a much wider and wholer and higher state from which you can function in the world. Okay.
About man and and maybe go down to the address with the people that are looking for anything. In addition to that, when we talked about vision, how do you, so I think I missed that.
Which part?
So the previous paragraph,
Previous paragraph. Yeah.
about man and safety and society as visible.
Um,
Then we go on to say that express the technical ethical
oh, the last previous page? Which are the lines? Can you just read those? Nor is there any reason why the divine man, the man who lives in the Brahmic consciousness and the God being, should not be all of these things in his action. He will be. Is that the one?
No. So then he says, his face, this is line seven. His place, man, and society that has
Ah, okay. So, yeah. So let me read that again. Yeah. So these it has replaced by or transmuted into a practical idealism and social, patriotic, and philanthropic devotion. It has got rid of God or kept him only for Sunday use and erected in his place man as its deity and society as its visible idol. So here he means that the modern mind has whether we like when we go very deep into the way that we are and what we are really busy doing, we have got rid of God is got rid of for Sunday prayers or for going to the temple, and then coming back. But even in the temple, you're mostly praying for things that you want in the world. And then when you come out, what we have done is we have created man as the uh, deity. For the modern man and for the modern humanity, the human being, a man meaning humanity, is the highest principle, and all of knowledge, whether it's science or arts or culture, or is at the at service of making man more and more materially comfortable, creating a supremacy of man over nature, whether it's the way that we have dominated the natural world and made extinct animals and have plundered and destroyed the earth, because we are the center of our universe, and all our society is centered around bringing man up in both material terms. What are we doing? We look at GDP, economic, all of us, what are we measuring ourselves with? And is there any element of God there, or the God state in anything, in the ways? Yeah, he's going, but I'm just explaining in simple words.
Basically, man is not the center.
Yes,
So man is not God per
yes.
se. But even for the best, if the highest man is there, will be altruistic.
Hmm.
But again, of course, it's an ideal man.
No, here, of course, he's also saying more than altruism. He's saying that the deity is man. We are all, everything in our modern society, all our inventions, all our works are for, are to raise man up as the Godhead. Man is the Godhead on which we are trying to do everything for. And society is its visible idol. Yeah.
Saying that humanity is while it is good, is a lesser purpose than serving divine.
No, at the moment he's just saying that humanity is what we're serving. And that later he says. But right now he's saying humanity is the Godhead of this of our modern age, and society is its idol. That's what he's saying. Okay?
It's actually an self-picture of the world. The man is the God.
Yeah.
And every other being will be natural.
Everything else is at its service. Yeah. Subservient. Yeah. At its best, it is practical, ethical, social, pragmatic, altruistic, humanitarian. Now, all these things are good, are especially needed at the present day, are part of the divine will, or they would not have become so dominant in humanity. Nor is there any reason why the divine man, the man who lives in the Brahmic consciousness, in the God being, should not be all these things in his action. He will be, if they are the best ideal of the age, the Yuga Dharma, and there is no yet higher ideal to be established, or great ideal, radical change to be effected. So, for he is, as the teacher points out to his disciple, the best, who has to set the standard for others, and so on. Then he says, where were we actually? We were, um, but the point here is that the modern mind has exiled from its practical motive power the two essential things, God, or the eternal, and spirituality and the God state. We read this paragraph. Therefore, it is a mistake to interpret the Gita from the standpoint of the mentality of today. Okay? Um, This is again, he goes to the same point. I want to read this again. Or if these higher things are now beginning to be vaguely envisaged as, the immutable, to live in God and so on and so forth, it is only to make them subservient to man and society, man the idol, and man the deity, and society the idol. But God and spirituality exist. But Sri Aurobindo points out that God and spirituality actually exist in their own right and not as adjuncts. And in practice, the lower in us must learn to exist for the higher, in order that the higher also may in us consciously exist for the lower, to draw it nearer to its own altitudes. Therefore, it is a mistake to interpret the Gita from the standpoint of the mentality of today and force it to teach us the disinterested performance of duty as the highest and all sufficient law. A little consideration of the situation with which the Gita deals will show us that this could not be its meaning. For the whole point of the teaching, that from which it arises, that which compels the disciple to seek the teacher in an inextricable clash of the various related conceptions of duty, ending in the collapse of the whole useful, intellectual, and moral edifice erected by the human mind. So, this is, he says, a little consideration will show us that the Gita cannot be interpreted as a gospel for the disinterested performance of duty as the highest and all sufficient law. Why? Because he says, for the whole point of the teaching, from where it arises, the disciple, why the disciple seeks the teacher, is in an inextricable clash of the various related conceptions of duty. Because there are all kinds of duties, and the clash of duty that has caused the war in the first place and is there right in front. In an inextricable clash of the various related conceptions of duty, ending in the collapse of the whole useful intellectual and moral edifice erected by the human mind. In human life, some sort of a clash arises fairly often, as for instance between domestic duties and the call of the country or the cause. So in our ordinary life, we also have these clash of duties. Who do we is our duty to our country, to our community, or to our family? And all these clashes of duty, like for Arjun, these also arise. In human life, some sort of a clash arises fairly often, as for instance, between domestic duties and the call of the country or the cause, or between the claim of the country and the good of humanity, yeah? Or you see the clash of duties, and should one do like for one's nation, or should one go for humanity? Or some larger religious or moral principle. An inner situation may even arise, as with the Buddha, in which all duties have to be abandoned, trampled on, flung aside in order to follow the call of the divine within. I cannot think that the Gita would solve such an inner situation by sending Buddha back to his wife and father and the government of the Sakya state, or would direct Ramakrishna to become a pandit in a vernacular school and disinterestedly teach little boys their lessons, or bind down a Vivekananda to support his family, and for that to follow dispassionately the law or medicine or journalism. So he's, of course, making a very uh, interesting, very, point that look, if this is to be a gospel of duty, if Gita was really a pure gospel of duty, of one's duty to one's family, duty to one's country, duty to one's religion, duty to one's community, to one's wife, to one's husband, to whatever it is, then how one should have told Buddha, you better not go back, come back and look after your father and look after your state, because he left his state. He was the ruler of the state, Sakya state. And the same he mentions, gives three examples. But it is obviously not that. The Gita does not teach the disinterested performance of duties. But this is the most important point. Every interpretation of the Gita is this disinterested performance of duty. In fact, those who come from homes and households, you're even told, read the Gita, you have to do, you must work for your family, you must not abandon, can't do this, you have to do your duties, all of that. But
There's one kind of duty to go under.
yeah,
Like you said, that it doesn't anywhere feel that this one is important than
no,
this
yes,
one. The take yourself.
yeah. So, and it doesn't say that duty is a bad thing either. But it just says it's not a gospel of duty in the ethical sense. There is something deeper in the Gita. But the duty is a different kind of duty. It is a duty first to understand what the divine that resides in your heart, is telling you as your swadharma. And if it is to protect your family and to live a life of a householder, then so be it. But it should be a conscious choice, and you should be able to surrender that and to live and do that in a way that you attain a God state. So you become if you're Janak, you become a king of a big state. But he was a yogi. He did it with such joy and bliss because he was doing it for the divine. Okay. So the Gita does not teach the disinterested performance of duties, but the following of the divine life, the abandonment of all dharmas, sarva dharmanam, to take refuge in the supreme alone and the divine activity of a Buddha, a Ramakrishna, a Vivekananda, is perfectly in consonance with this teaching. So, nay, although the Gita prefers action to inaction, it does not rule out the renunciation of works, but accepts it as one of the ways to the divine. So here he's talking about the Catholicity of the Gita. Its Catholic nature. We use the word now to say that it's universal nature. It tends to be all prevailing. It tends to not have it's not, it doesn't have a moralistic, one-sided view of life. It has a rounded view of life. So,
And there are no scientific that is because the problem between the lower and the higher. You think that it's a conduit.
it's a conduit. Yes. So the lower is used as a conduit to get to the higher. And therefore the law of graduality, which is very much the Indian dharmic law, the lower is meant as a stepping stone. You can't immediately rush into Brahmic consciousness. But till you're in your ordinary consciousness, how do you perform? What do? You perform your duties. But how do you perform your duties is important. You try and perform it with the ideal of offering it as to the divine or to the highest part in yourself or the highest principle in which you exist. Here in the Gita, it is Sri Krishna. It is you offer it to this and surrender it to the divine. So whatever you do, whether you are sweeping, whether you are in the most ordinary consciousness, and you have not as yet reached that Brahmic consciousness, every action of yours can be used towards that. That's what it said.
But this is actually
Is
from the disinterested performance to interested performance. Is that what?
it's a very interesting word you use, disinterested performance of duty to an interested performance of duty. Interested in what is my question?
In the sense that you are not looking at the essence of what you are doing,
Hmm.
not doing disinterested performances, but how to motivate that performing for you.
For the sake of others. My heart is not in it, but I'm performing it for the sake of others.
Correct.
So interested performance is what?
It's from within.
From within, that my heart is not is doing it, even though my heart is in it, that it is doing it for as an offering, so that my being gets transmuted and can change its vibrational quality of egoism and egoistic I-ness to a wider sense of universality, of the divine consciousness. Now, what is the divine? It's the God state. So, are you all muted there? I don't know. Everybody seems to be muted. Okay. Anuradha, have you muted everybody? I think you can unmute yourself if you
Did,
wish to speak.
but everybody has muted themselves.
Oh, that's fine. So as long as they know they have the option.
We had similar discussion in last chapter as well.
Yeah.
And we are actually following our conditioning. And then at one point we have to abandon everything.
So Gita does not teach the disinterested performance of duties, but the following of the divine, the abandonment of all dharmas, of all duties, sarva dharmanam, to take refuge in the supreme alone. And the divine activity of a Buddha, a Ramakrishna, Vivekananda is perfectly in consonance with this teaching. Nay, although the Gita prefers action to inaction, it does not rule out the renunciation of works, but accepts it as one of the ways to the divine. If that can only be attained by renouncing works and life and all duties, and the call is strong within us, then into the bonfire they must go. So this inner call is very important. What if the call is strong, that this is the only way that I can reach that supreme state of God, of Godhead in myself, then yes, into the bonfire all the duties go. And there is no help for it. The call of God is imperative and cannot be weighed against any other considerations. But here, sorry? Yeah, yeah. But here there is this further difficulty that the action which Arjuna must do is one from which his moral sense recoils, because he has to kill his cousins. It is his duty to fight, you say. But that duty has now become to his mind a terrible sin. How does it help him or solve his difficulty to tell him that he must do his duty disinterestedly, dispassionately? How does it help him or solve his problem? By telling him, do your duty, but do it disinterestedly and dispassionately. He will want to know which is his duty or how it can be his duty to destroy in a sanguinary massacre his kin, his race, and his country. He is told that he has right on his side, but that does not and cannot satisfy him, because his very point is that the justice of his legal claim does not justify him in supporting it by a pitiless massacre destructive to the future of his nation. Is he then to act dispassionately in the sense of not caring whether it is a sin or what its consequences may be, so long as he does his duty as a soldier? Very important question. How is Arjuna to act? If you say it's a gospel of duty, then is he to act dispassionately in the sense of not caring whether it is a sin or what its consequences may be, so long as he does his duty as a soldier by killing well, half his family or more than half? That may be the teaching of a state, of politicians, of lawyers, of ethical casuists. It can never be the teaching of a great religious and philosophical scripture which sets out to solve the problem of life and action from the very roots. So obviously, Arjuna is not being asked to go into war and kill everybody because from a sense of duty. That you can, he says, you can do, you know, a great scripture, spiritual scripture like the Gita would not be doing something like that. And if that is what the Gita has to say on a most poignant moral and spiritual problem, we must put it out of the list of the world's scriptures and thrust it, if anywhere, then into our library of political science and ethical casuistry. You understood this? Yes? Everybody? Undoubtedly, the Gita does, like the Upanishads, teach the equality which rises above sin and virtue, beyond good and evil, but only as a part of the Brahmanic consciousness and for the man who is on the path and advanced enough to fulfill the supreme rule. It does not preach indifference to good and evil for the ordinary life of man, where such a doctrine would have the most pernicious consequence. So, undoubtedly, it teaches equality, to rise above sin and virtue, okay, beyond good and evil. And but only it teaches that only as part of a Brahmic consciousness, God consciousness, the God state, consciousness of the divine state, and for the man who is on the path and advanced enough to fulfill the supreme rule. You have to also have the requisite qualities um, to perform this and to do this. So advanced enough, who is on the path and advanced enough to fulfill the supreme rule. It does not preach indifference to good and evil for the ordinary life of man. I think this is what you were pointing out. This indifference can be taken by we are in an ordinary state. For us, this would be pernicious if we were to become like this, indifferent. Yeah, 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 yeah. So it does not preach indifference to good and evil for the ordinary life of man. It only preaches that for the man who is already advanced enough to fulfill the supreme rule and is going towards the Brahmic consciousness. On the contrary, it affirms that the doers of evil shall not attain to God. Therefore, if Arjuna simply seeks to fulfill in the best way the ordinary law of man's life, which is disinterested performance of what he feels to be a sin, a thing of hell, will not help him even though that sin be his duty as a soldier. So, therefore, if Arjuna simply seeks to fulfill in the best performance of what he feels to be a sin, a thing of hell, will not help him even though that sin be his duty as a soldier. He must refrain from what his conscience abhors, though 1,000 duties were shattered to pieces. Now you must understand what Sri Aurobindo was saying here. He must refrain from what his conscience abhors, even though 1,000 duties were shattered to pieces. We must remember that duty is an idea which in practice rests upon social conceptions. What is duty? It is an idea that in practice rests upon social conceptions. We may extend the term beyond its proper connotation and talk of our duty to ourselves, or we may, if we like, say in a transcendent sense that it was Buddha's duty to abandon all, or even that it is the ascetic's duty to sit motionless in a cave. But this is obviously to play with words. Duty is a relative term and depends upon our relation to others. It is a father's duty, as a father, to nurture and educate his children, a lawyer's to do his best for his client, even if he knows him to be guilty and his defense to be a lie. A soldier's to fight and shoot, to order even if he kill his own kin and countrymen. A judge's to send the guilty to prison and hang the murderer. And so long as these positions are accepted, the duty remains clear, a practical matter, of course, even when it is not a point of honor or affection, and overrides the absolute religious or moral law. So, so long as these positions are accepted, the duty remains clear, a practical matter, of course, even when it is not a point of honor or affection, and overrides the absolute religious or moral. But what if the inner view is changed? If the lawyer is awakened to the absolute sinfulness of falsehood, the judge becomes convinced that capital punishment is a crime against humanity. The man called upon to the battlefield feels like the conscientious objector of today, or as a Tolstoy would feel, that in no circumstances is it permissible to take human life any more than to eat human flesh. These are the questions. It is obvious that here the moral law, which is above all relative duties, must prevail. It is obvious here that the moral law, which is above relative duties, must prevail. And that law depends on no social relation or conception of duty, but on the awakened inner perception of man, the moral being. So he is here saying that in these circumstances, it is the moral law that prevails over the social and uh, other conception of duty that otherwise rules these professions and uh, these people. If the inner being awakens, then the moral law supersedes the ethical reality. There are in the world, in fact, two different laws of conduct, each valid on its own plane. The rule principally dependent on external status, and the rule independent of status and entirely dependent on thought and conscience. So, what I'm going to do today is that I'm going to actually stop here because I know we won't be able to complete this chapter today. And I think if we can read this again and take this up next time, because I think if we, and I will read this particular thought again of the different types of duties and which one supersedes what, and what Aurobindo was really to say here. If we can contemplate and ruminate over this, I think we will get a sense of where he is leading us, and we can take this up next time. Would that be okay? Yeah. Because I can see that for some of us it's already getting a little dense. Yes, it is deep. Any questions from our online participants? Or comments or insights? Sorry? Or are you? Yeah. Yeah. From one to the last. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. So what she's saying is that what Aurobindo is essentially talking about is a law of graduality, that everything has to go from one step to the next step to the next step. You can't take a flying leap into the last without first going through these steps. Okay. We end with a meditation. Very good evening or good day. Um, we were at the core of the teaching last time and we were in the middle of the chapter. So I thought we would start a little before where we ended so that there is the um, chain of thought that begins. Yeah. Uh, I think the central ideas from the last reading is the difference between the modern mind or the modern man and um, the Gita and the scripture and the time that the Gita was set in. And he does it beautifully. Of course, it's a very long sentence, so you'll have to break it into different parts. The modern mind is exiled from its practical motive power, two essential things, God or the eternal, and spirituality or the God state. And then what it lives in humanity and not, and the Gita would have us live in God, though for the world in God, then the modern mind lives in the vital and the mental and the emotional being, while the Gita would have us live in the spirit. It lives in the mutable being. The modern mind lives in the sense of the divine presence in all creatures, while the Gita would have us live also in the immutable and the supreme. So, And the modern man believes and lives in the changing march of time, and is very, um, you know, prone to think that is the only truth, while the Gita would have us live in the eternal. So these are some of the important ideas in this page. The next page, of course, speaks about what it means to be disinterested. The Gita does not teach the disinterested performance of duties, but the following of the divine life and the abandonment of all dharmas, all ethical norms and ideas. And so, therefore, the Sarva Dharmanam, to take refuge in the Supreme alone. Um, the call of God is imperative and cannot be weighed against any other considerations. So, uh, now we go to the next idea, which is, and we'll start from page 34, the core of the teaching. Oh, the paragraph beginning, undoubtedly, the Gita does, like the Upanishads, teach the equality which rises above sin and virtue, beyond good and evil, but only as a part of the Brahmic consciousness, and for the man who is on the path and advanced enough to fulfill the supreme rule. So it does not preach indifference to good and evil for the ordinary life of man. So this is important. While the Gita, like the Upanishads, teaches equality to rise between sin and virtue, good and evil, but this equality is only as part of the Brahmic consciousness and for the man who is path, on the path of yoga, not for the ordinary man. So those who are practicing yoga, the whole, you know, system of yoga, for them, yes, to rise above all this, good and evil and all that is fine because they are on the on the path and advanced enough to fulfill the supreme rule. It does not preach indifference to good and evil for the ordinary life of man. So, those who are in the ordinary life, it does not preach indifference to them, where such a doctrine would have the most pernicious consequences. So you can imagine if the mass of humanity were to be indifferent to good and indifferent to evil, what a terrible state society would be in. We would not care of, the worst atrocities or even be, what should I say, our noblest emotions and our heroism would not be awakened by the greatest deeds of sacrifice. So both good and evil. On the contrary, it affirms that the doers of evil shall not attain to God. Therefore, if Arjuna simply seeks to fulfill in the best way the ordinary law of man's life, disinterested performance of what he feels to be a sin, a thing of hell, will not help him, even though that sin be his duty as a soldier. So if Arjuna simply seeks to fulfill in the best way the ordinary law of man's life, which is disinterested performance of what he feels to be a sin, a thing of hell, this will not help him even though that sin be his duty as a soldier. He must refrain from what his conscience abhors, though 1,000 duties were shattered to pieces. We must remember that duty is an idea which in practice rests upon social conceptions. We may extend the term beyond its proper connotation and talk of our duty to ourselves, or we may, if we like, say in a transcendent sense that it was Buddha's duty to abandon all, or even that it is the ascetic's duty to sit motionless in a cave. But this is obviously to play with words. Duty is a relative term and depends upon our relation to others. Now, he here again makes a distinction between Arjun and the common man. He says Arjuna must has is he must refrain from what his conscience abhors, though 1,000 duties were shattered to pieces. However, for the ordinary person, the duty is a necessity, otherwise there is no ethical or moral uh, progression. So then he goes on. Duty is a relative term and depends upon our relation to others. It is a father's duty as a father to nurture and educate his children, a lawyer's to do his best for his um, for his client, even if he knows him to be guilty and his defense to be a lie. A soldier's to fight and shoot to order, even if he kill his own kin and countrymen. A judge is to send the guilty to prison and hang the murderer. And so long as these positions are accepted, the duty remains clear. A practical matter of course, even when it is not a point of honor or affection, and overrides the absolute religious or moral law. But what if the inner view is changed? If the lawyer is awakened to the absolute sinfulness of falsehood, the judge becomes convinced that the capital punishment is a crime against humanity. The man called upon to the battlefield feels like the conscientious objector of today, or as a Tolstoy would feel, that in no circumstances is it permissible to take human life any more than to eat human flesh. It is obvious that here the moral law, which is above all relative duties, must prevail. So he then makes the law of graduality, a distinction between following the moral law, which is the father's duty and the judge's duty and the lawyer's duty and so on, and where the inner conscience, that's a very important word to distinguish it, is where the inner uh, conscience of the person uh, awakens, or the inner what should I say, uh, soul of the person awakens and it feels like Tolstoy did, or like the judge does, or whatever. In those circumstances only, it is obvious that here the moral law, which is duty, which is above all relative duties, must prevail. The moral law prevails over relative duties, and that law depends on no social relation or conception of duty, but on the awakened inner perception of man, the moral being. So here the difference between the ethical, what should I say, the duty, which is obedience to the social uh, conventions and social relations and conceptions of duty, as differentiated between the um, moral law, which is awakened due to the inner perception of man, the moral being. There are in the world, in fact, two different laws of conduct, each valid on its own plane. The rule principally dependent on external status, and the rule independent of status and entirely dependent on thought and conscience. The two different laws of conduct, each important and valid in their own plane. One is the rule principally dependent on external status, and the rule independent of status and entirely dependent on the thought and conscience. The Gita does not teach us to subordinate the higher plane to the lower. It does not ask the awakened moral consciousness to slay itself on the altar of duty as a sacrifice and victim to the law of the social status. So, this is very important because many people and many interpreters of the Gita read the Gita as, especially the first part of the Gita, principally to bring home the idea of duty, obedience, uh, and, rather than the idea that these are all grades of progression, and the higher is always has precedence over the lower. And this is what the Gita also stresses, and then goes to the third highest, which he will talk about later. So the Gita does not teach us to subordinate the higher plane to the lower. It does not ask the awakened moral consciousness to slay itself on the altar of duty as a sacrifice and victim, the law of the social status. So, for example, and then he gives that example, I think, later, or he gave it earlier actually. If somebody got an awakening to the divine, the call for yoga or for the divine consciousness, but is in a social, what should I say, arrangement where he or she cannot get out of it, then and is due to bound to continue because of one's husband or in-laws or family or whatever. So what does that person, how does that person choose? Does he choose his duty to his family, or does he choose um, his call for a spiritual um, quest and yoga? So the answer to that is that depends on the awakened inner conscience of that person. That is something very inward. It's a perception and the inner push and the call and the voice of one's inner being. So that is why he says that the lower is always subject. The lower is always subject to the higher. So the higher rules. And then he grades this, and the Gita does that. So the Gita does not teach us to subordinate so and so. It calls us higher and not lower. From the conflict of the two planes of duty and the moral conscience or the inner awakening, it calls us higher and not lower. From the conflict of the two planes, it bids us ascend to a supreme poise above the mainly practical, above the purely ethical, to the Brahmic consciousness. It replaces the conception of social duty by a divine obligation. The subjection to external law gives place to a certain principle of inner self-determination of action. So here it is. The subjection to external law, whatever that external law may be, gives place to a certain principle of inner is important, self-determination of action, proceeding by the soul's freedom from the tangled law of works. So remember, it's the soul's freedom, not the vital's freedom, not the emotional being's freedom. It is the soul's freedom from the tangled law of works. And this, as we shall see, the Brahmic consciousness, the soul's freedom from works, and the determination of works in the nature by the Lord within and above us, is the kernel of the Gita's teaching with regard to action. So, what is the kernel of the Gita's teaching with regard to action? The soul's freedom from works and the determination of works in the nature by the Lord within us and above us. So that takes precedence over the outer law and the outer, uh, what should I say, moral, social obligations of society, of family, of uh, and etc. That's why the Gita is a scriptural writing. It's not a writing on society, or it's not a book of political jurisprudence. It is for those who want to ascend to a higher consciousness. The Gita can only be understood like any other great work of the kind by studying it in its entirety and as a developing argument. But the modern interpreters, starting from the great writer Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who first gave to the Gita this new sense of a gospel of duty, have laid an almost exclusive stress on the first 3 or 4 chapters of the Gita. And in those, on the idea of equality, on the expression kartavyam karma, the work that has to be done, which they render by duty, and on the phrase, thou hast a right to action, but none to the fruits of action, which is now popularly quoted as the great word Mahavakya. Now, this, of course, we have all heard through our childhood, uh, from our parents, grandparents, and teachers about this gospel of duty, this kartavyam karma, the work that has to be done. Thou has a right to action, but none to the fruits of action. So this is in the first 4 chapters of the Gita, very clearly mentioned and emphasized, which is now popularly quoted as the great word Mahavakya of the Gita. The rest of the 18 chapters, with their high philosophy, are given a secondary importance, except indeed the great vision in the 11th. The vision, you know which vision it is? It is the great vision in the 11th of the avatar, when you get the Vishwarupa of Krishna, Sri Krishna. This is natural enough for the modern mind, which is, or has been till yesterday, inclined to be impatient of metaphysical subtleties and far off spiritual seekings, eager to get to work, and like Arjuna, mainly concerned for a workable law of work, a dharma. So, this way of interpreting the Gita, which as a gospel of duty and a kartavyam karma, and that you have a right to work but not to the fruits, and limiting it to that only, appeals especially to the modern mind, which is inclined to be impatient of anything metaphysical and what it calls sees as far off spiritual seekings, and is eager to get to work. And like Arjuna himself, mainly concerned for a workable law of works, a dharma. But it is the wrong way to handle the scripture. So, why is it wrong? The equality which the Gita teaches, the equality which the Gita preaches, is not disinterestedness. The great command to Arjun, given after the foundation and main structure of the teaching have been laid and built, is arise, slay thy enemies, enjoy a prosperous kingdom. Now you see the words that Sri Krishna uses when he speaks to Arjun after laying the full foundation and the main structure of the teaching. He doesn't say, give up the world, go into inner contemplation, look for the divine, go above in samadhi, sit in meditation. He doesn't say any of these things to Arjun. What does he say instead? He says, arise, slay thy enemies, and then the most important word, enjoy the prosperous kingdom. What is he saying? Enjoyment, prosperity, kingdom, slay thy enemies. This is the very, very interesting things that Sri Krishna tells Arjuna. So, the equality which the Gita teaches is what then? It is not a disinterestedness, to become disinterested in all things and all works. So, what is it? He says this. So, arise, slay thy enemies, enjoy a prosperous kingdom. Has not the ring of an uncompromising altruism or of a white, dispassionate abnegation. It is a state of inner poise and wideness. This wideness is very important. Inner poise, wideness, which is the foundation of spirit freedom. So freedom, spirituality, they both are very closely linked. With that poise, in that freedom, we have to do the work that is to be done. A phrase which the Gita uses with the greatest wideness, including in it all work, sarva karma, and which far exceeds, though it may include social duties or ethical obligations. Exceeds it, though it may include it. What is the work to be done? What is the work to be done is not to be determined by the individual choice. Now, this is extremely important. Nor is the right to action and the rejection of claim to the fruit, the great word of the Gita. This must be quite a surprise to all of us. So, what is the work to be done is not to be determined by the individual choice. And how do you determine what work you have to do? It will come. Nor is the right to the action and the rejection of claim to the fruit the great word of the Gita, but only a preliminary word. It is only a preliminary word governing the first state of the disciple when he begins ascending the hill of yoga. So here Sri Aurobindo distinguishes between the first stage of the Gita's teaching, the second stage of the Gita's teaching, and the final stage. So there are, in these chapters, there are different bhagas or different quartets. The first four chapters, the next, and so on. Now, he says this is definitely there, but if you make this into the entire gospel and understanding of the Gita and forget the rest of the Gita, then it is kind of a travesty. So, what is the work to be done is not to be determined by the individual choice, nor is the right to action and the rejection of claim to the fruit, the great word of the Gita, but only a preliminary word governing the first state of the disciple when he begins ascending the hill of yoga. It is practically suspended. It is practically suspended. Sorry? Oh, sorry. I wonder why I'm reading that. It is practically superseded at a subsequent stage. So, superseded meaning that something, yes. So it is practically superseded at a subsequent stage, for the Gita goes on to affirm emphatically that the man is not the doer of the action, it is Prakriti, it is nature, it is the great force with its three modes of action that works through him. And he must learn to see that it is not he who does the work. Therefore, the right to action is an idea which is only valid so long as we are still under the illusion of being the doer. It must necessarily disappear from the mind like the claim to the fruit as soon as we cease to be, to our own consciousness, the doer of our works. All pragmatic egoism, whether of the claim to fruits or of the right to action, is then at an end. These are extremely important ideas that are presented here in the core of the teaching, which of course will be taken up again later on. So we need not spend too much time trying to understand all the nuances, but it is sufficient to understand that there is a progression in the way that the Gita unfolds its message. And it takes from the unripe but ready disciple who is ready to climb the hill of yoga, which is where the point at which Arjuna begins, to later on that he that has started the ascent in yoga and the progression, therefore, of movement between me, I. He sees Arjuna when he begins the battle in the Mahabharata. He sees himself as the doer, the one that is going to slay and kill his kin and his family, and is going to wage the battle of Mahabharata. And therefore, he has the pragmatic egoism of the doer. And Sri Krishna does not disturb that. And it is important that he does not disturb that. Because if he were to disturb it too early, and Arjuna is not ready at that point to be able to understand that he is not the doer, but actually it is nature and Prakriti. It is the three modes and the three gunas that are acting through him. And he is moved by one of the gunas, whether it's the rajogun or the tamogun or the sattvic nature. So these three gunas of the mental, vital, uh, physical nature, they are the ones that govern. And therefore he sees later that um, he understands only afterwards that when Sri Krishna tells him and he refuses, but I've already killed them, he minds to. So, what is the work to be done is not to be determined by the individual choice, nor is it the right to action and the rejection of claim to the fruit, the great word of the Gita, but only a preliminary word. It is practically superseded at a subsequent stage, for the Gita goes on to affirm emphatically that the man is not the doer of the action, it is Prakriti, it is nature who is doing the action. It is the great force with its three modes of action that works through him. And he must learn to see that it is not he who does the work. Now, in our own lives, there comes a time when we begin to have this inner realization or sense or intuition that it is not I who do the work, but there is something that does this work through me. But for a long time, and especially in our youth and so on, we are very full of the sense of our own, uh, um, doership. So learn to see that it is not he who does the work. Therefore, the right to action is an idea which is only valid so long as we are still under the illusion of being the doer. It must necessarily disappear from the mind like the claim to the fruit as soon as we cease to be, to our own consciousness, the doer of our works. All pragmatic egoism, whether of the claim to fruits or of the right to action, is then at an end. But the determinism of Prakriti is not the last word of the Gita. The equality of the will and the rejection of fruits are only means for entering with the mind and the heart and the understanding into the divine consciousness and living in it. And the Gita expressly says that they are to be employed as a means as long as the disciple is unable so to live or even to seek by practice the gradual development of this higher state. So even this determination of Prakriti, what he says, is not the last one. There is something beyond being ruled by ones, that the doer is the modes of nature, the three gunas. But this is what he says is the gradual development, law of graduality that the Gita follows. So the equality of the will and the rejection of fruits are only means for entering with the mind and heart and understanding into the divine consciousness and living in it. And the Gita expressly says that they are to be employed as a means, as long as the disciple is unable so to live or even to seek by practice the gradual development of this higher state. Now, this higher state, when one becomes conscious that one is not the doer of works, but actually that the works are being done. In the first part of this state, it is that you become conscious that the works are being done by Prakriti, by nature. Then, when you get into the next part of the deeper consciousness, when you ascend higher, you realize actually when you enter into the soul state and the divine state, you realize that the doer of your works is actually the divine. It is the divine consciousness. So this happens through uh, time, through practice. That is why you're climbing the hill of yoga. And as you keep ascending from plane to plane, from ascent to ascent, you get these realizations. So, yeah. And what is this divine? What is this divine whom Krishna declares himself to be? It is the Purushottam beyond the self that acts not, beyond the Prakriti that acts. So, this divine which Krishna declares himself to be is the Purushottam. Which Purushottam? That is beyond the self, that acts not, and beyond the Prakriti that acts. So, it's beyond Prakriti and the Purusha. Foundation of the one, master of the other. Foundation of the one is Purusha, master of the other is Prakriti. So this self, this is what this is the divine who Krishna declares himself to be. It is the Purushottam beyond the self that acts not, beyond the Prakriti that acts, foundation of the one, master of the other, the Lord of whom all is the manifestation, who even in our present subjection to Maya sits in the heart of his creatures, governing the works of Prakriti. So that is the divine, who even in our present subjection to Maya sits in the heart of his creatures, governing the works of Prakriti. But he by whom the armies on the field of Kurukshetra have already been slain while yet they live, and who uses Arjun only as an instrument or immediate occasion of this great slaughter. So that is the divine whom Krishna declares himself to be. He is above, and he is that even he is that even Prakriti itself is governed by the divine. But the Maya of Prakriti doesn't allow us to see that. He by whom the armies on the field of Kurukshetra have already been slain while yet they live, and who uses Arjuna only as an instrument or immediate occasion of this great slaughter. Prakriti is only his executive force. Whose executive force? Hmm? Yeah, of the Prakriti is only his executive force of the Purusha, of the divine, of even of that of the God realized. Anyone who is conscious of the divine will at that stage begin to see that Prakriti is only the divine's force. Prakriti is only his executive force. So here Krishna, what is this divine that Krishna declares himself? This is an explanation of this This is the divine that Krishna declares himself to be. The disciple has to rise beyond this force and its three modes or gunas. We've spoken about that. He has to become three guna titta. Not to her has he to surrender his actions. To her meaning Prakriti. He does not need to surrender his actions to Prakriti, to nature, to the Maya of the world. Not to her has he to surrender his actions, over which he has no longer any claim or right, but into the being of the Supreme, reposing his mind and understanding, heart and will in him, with self-knowledge, with God knowledge, with world knowledge, with a perfect equality, a perfect devotion, an absolute self-giving. He has to do works as an offering to the Master of all self-energizings and all sacrifice. So works as he has to do works as an offering to the Master of all self-energizings and all sacrifice, identified in will, conscious with that consciousness that shall decide and initiate the action. This is the solution which the divine teacher offers to the disciple. That shall decide and initiate the action. So once one is able to offer all one's works and surrender all one's being to the divine consciousness, then it is the divine consciousness that picks us up and becomes dominant, comes forward in our own consciousness. And the ego consciousness then resides back and allows the divine consciousness to govern our being and guide us to what action to take. What the supreme word of the Gita is, its Mahavakya, we have not to seek. For the Gita itself declares it in its last utterance, the crowning note of the great diapason. So, what is this great Mahavakya? Now, unlike the Mahavakya that what Aurobindo distinguishes, that is actually the first four chapters where most people think the Mahavakya of the Gita is, to do one's work or one's duty without expectation of fruit or result. He says, no. In fact, the Mahavakya of the Gita is already written and it's in the last what the supreme word of the Gita is. It's Mahavakya, we have not to seek. For the Gita itself declares it in its last utterance, the crowning note of the great diapason. With the Lord, and what is that? He's in quotation marks. Is of course direct translation of the Gita shloka. With the Lord in thy heart, take refuge with all thy being. With the Lord in thy heart, take refuge with all thy being. By his grace, thou shalt attain to the supreme peace and the eternal status. So have I expounded to thee a knowledge more secret than that which is hidden. Further, hear the most secret, the supreme word that I shall speak to thee. Become my-minded, devoted to me do sacrifice and adoration. Infallibly, thou shalt come to me, for dear to me art thou. Abandoning all law of conduct, seek refuge in me alone. Abandoning all laws of conduct, seek refuge in me alone. I will release thee from all sin. Do not grieve. The argument of the Gita resolves itself into three great steps, by which action rises out of the human into the divine plane. So, this is the Mahavakya of the Gita. It's very, very important. The first line is the most important. With the Lord in thy heart, take refuge with all thy being. And first, the Lord has to come into our hearts and become the master of our being, not the ego. That itself takes a long time. The first part of the Gita helps us to bring that forward and to supplement the ego. Then the second part comes. Then by his grace thou shalt attain to the supreme peace and the eternal status. Then he says something beautiful. So have I expounded to thee a knowledge more secret than that which is hidden. Further here, the most secret, the supreme word that I shall speak to thee. Become mind-minded. What does that mean? Become mind-minded. Devoted to me do sacrifice and adoration. So this idea of bhakti, mind-minded, the importance of the three, you see, in the beginning we start with the Gita. It starts with works, knowledge, and then ends with bhakti and surrender. How do you become mind-minded? That when you're being, through your devotion, through your love, you are able to surrender and give of yourself. Only when you are able to empty yourself through, then only the divine conscious can fill you. Your cup has to be empty first to offer yourself. So become mind-minded, devoted to me, to me do sacrifice and adoration, infallibly. Thou shalt come to me, for dear to me art thou. Abandoning all laws of conduct, seek refuge in me alone. I will release thee from all sin. Do not grieve. The argument of the Gita resolves itself into three great steps, by which action rises out of the human into the divine plane, leaving the bondage of the lower for the liberty of a higher law. First, by the renunciation of desire and a perfect equality of works, have to be done as a sacrifice by man, as the doer. A sacrifice. So what does sacrifice mean? To make sacred, to offer. Yes? The first is by renunciation of desire. Because why desire of all things? Because desire is the main engine of the ego and drives the ego. The desire self is the ego self. So the renunciation of desire by doing what? And a perfect equality, uh, first by the renunciation of desire and a perfect equality, works have to be done as a sacrifice by man. That is why he has to do all work as a sacrifice by man as the doer, a sacrifice to a deity who is supreme and only self, though who is supreme and only self, though by him not yet realized in his own being. Though he doesn't realize the supreme self, yet by doing sacrifice, offering all his works, he begins to perceive him. This is the initial step. And the second step, secondly, not only renouncing the desire of the fruit, but the claim to be the doer of works has to be renounced. In the realization of the self as the equal, the inactive, the immutable principle, and of all works is simply the operation of universal force of the nature soul, Prakriti, the unequal, active, mutable power. So as we have spoken of earlier, not only the desire of the fruit, but the claim to be the doer. But the claim to be the doer of works, the sense of being that I am doing this, claim to be the doer of works has to be renounced in the realization of the self as the equal, the inactive, the immutable principle and of all works as simply the operation of universal force of the nature soul, Prakriti, the unequal, active, mutable power. Lastly, the third step, the Supreme Self has to be seen as the Supreme Purusha governing this Prakriti. So, the Supreme Self has to be seen as the Supreme Purush governing this Prakriti, of whom the soul in nature is a partial manifestation, by whom all works are directed in a perfect transcendence through nature. So, to become aware of the Purusha and when one lives in the Purusha or the Purushottam, then the Purusha becomes the master of Prakriti and is governs and become aware that the Prakriti itself is a part of the Purush. So it's a supreme Purush, not just normal Purush, but the supreme Purush, which is seen as the supreme Purusha governing this Prakriti, of whom the soul in nature, who is the soul in nature? Human being, you and me, is a partial manifestation of this supreme, by whom all works are directed in a perfect transcendence through nature. To him, love and adoration and the sacrifice of works have to be offered. To him, the Supreme Purusha, love and adoration and the sacrifice of works have to be offered. The whole being has to surrender, the whole being has to be surrendered to him and the whole consciousness raised up to dwell in this divine consciousness, so that the human soul may share in his divine transcendence of nature and of his works, and act in a perfect spiritual liberty. So this is the third step, the giving up of one of to live in the witness self, the supreme Purusha, let that govern Prakriti, which is the outer nature of the mental, vital, physical, the gunas, and through that to um, and to him sacrifice, uh, to him love and adoration and sacrifice of works, to offer that and to surrender to him the whole consciousness, and to dwell in this divine consciousness so that the human soul may share in his divine transcendence of nature and of his works and act in a perfect spiritual liberty. The first step is karma yoga. We saw what is it now? You go back to the first step. What is that? Sorry? Renunciation of desire and perfect equality and sacrifice, right? So the first step is karma yoga, the selfless sacrifice of works. And here the Gita's insistence is on action. The second is jnana yoga, the self-realization and knowledge of the true nature of the self and the world. So what is the second step? Jnana yoga. To not only the desire of the fruit, but the claim to be the doer of works have to be renounced. So that is when you have the jnana, that you are not the doer, and that there is something that is higher and deeper that is actually doing all works. So the second is jnana yoga, the self-realization and knowledge of the true nature of the self and the world. And here the insistence is on knowledge. But the sacrifice of works continues. and the path of works becomes one with, but does not disappear into the path of knowledge. So it doesn't mean that once you get into Jnana Yoga, you stop Karma Yoga. You continue that. It becomes, the sacrifice of works continues, and the path of works becomes one with, but does not disappear into the path of knowledge. And the last step is Bhakti Yoga, adoration and seeking of the Supreme Self as the Divine Being. And here the insistence is on devotion, but the knowledge is not subordinated, only raised, vitalized, and fulfilled. And still the sacrifice of works continues. So the Bhakti Yoga. I tell you, I just came back yesterday. I went to the Golden Temple for the first time in my life. And I was struck. It was amazing experience. I'm struck by the one thing that struck me was the bhakti that was there, amongst the disciples, amongst the general mass. And I think I went into a kind of inner reverie, and I was taken to certain places, saw certain things, very long to describe. But let me explain that, it gave me a complete experience of what it means to love and to be totally devoted in that love for the Supreme. And there are currents in our country, in our religions, in our sects, in our whatever you want to call it, that actually epitomize one or two or all these yogas. The Bhakti Yoga is something that needs to be developed. We cannot be arid because this last surrender of the divine, and anything that helps you to open your heart to the divine, to the highest, is something one must seek. Whether it is music or nature or whatever it may be. But I was deeply, deeply impressed. It just happened, so I thought I mention it. Okay, so the last step is Bhakti Yoga, adoration and seeking of the Supreme Self as the divine being. And here the insistence is on devotion. But the knowledge is not subordinated, only raised, vitalized, and fulfilled. And still the sacrifice of works continues. The double path becomes the triune way of knowledge, works, and devotion. So this double path of Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga becomes the triple triune way, the triple path of knowledge, works, and devotion. And the fruit of the sacrifice, the one fruit still placed before the seeker, is attained, union with the divine being. What is the fruit of the sacrifice in the Gita's yoga? Union with the divine being and oneness with the supreme divine nature. Yeah. So we can open for any questions or remarks or
Can I ask a question, please? Um, Can you
yes.
hear me?
Yes, Jayashree.
I wanted to ask, what is this equality of will that he
Equality
talks of will?
of will. Yes.
Yeah, he talks about the equality of will. I didn't quite understand that. And the second one is the determinism of Prakriti. Could you please explain that? Thank
So
you.
can you read the sentence where he talks about the equality of will?
Yeah, I'll just page 34, he says, undoubtedly, the Gita does, like the Upanishads, teach the equality which rises above sin and virtue.
Hmm.
And then, I mean, equality to what and how do we get that? That's my question. The equality which Gita preaches is not disinterestedness.
Hmm.
And then he talks about equality quite a bit. I'm not
Yes,
finding,
yes, it does. You're
yeah,
not finding exact words. Okay. All right. So, um, here what he means here is obviously the equality that rises. Equality is clear, is samatha, right? So
yes,
equality of is basically when you have a certain sense of um a base of samatha without getting disturbed with the outer happenings, whether they be good or bad, sinful or whatever, and keeping a certain samatha. Now, that samatha is a very base of one's consciousness. Unless if one is going to get, upset and disturbed by everything that happens, one will not be able to gain knowledge, because for knowledge, discrimination is required, and for discrimination, one needs to have a certain equality, and this equality, samatha also, if you read, in fact, if you read record of yoga, in the incarnate word, you go to record of yoga and just go to the first, just type in samatha, and you will see under that different kinds of equality, starting from, endurance, then to stoicness, then to samatha, then to different, and Sri Aurobindo gives different Sanskrit words for each one of them. So this equality has to become a what he talks about equality, because in the Gita that is one of the pillars on which the nature needs to poise itself, is self poise that he talks about. That poise is the poise of equality and samatha.
okay, okay.
And
So,
now, second, sorry, you had another question. The
no,
determination of nature.
the same thing. It implies, therefore, certain detachment from one's involvement. We involve ourselves in all our activities with the willpower. That's the involvement. So, what you're telling me is that it requires a certain distancing from that involvement, a certain detachment in order to see things objectively, so that I may know what to choose correctly,
Hmm.
right?
So, yes, in the sense of detachment, in terms of not getting disturbed or
Yes,
perturbed, but not
yes,
detachment in the sense of not getting, of being indifferent.
no,
The
yeah,
difference between, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And the second question was the determinism of nature. What is this determinism? Is it the Prakriti and her gunas?
Yes, the determination of nature is the prakriti of the world.
I see. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Amita.
I had a question. Am I audible?
Yes, you
Yeah.
are.
Yes. This is Sabina Amita.
Yeah, I see.
I'm finding this last section a little problematic
Mhm,
because I'm finding it difficult to understand the fact that
mhm,
the Gita is telling you to distance yourself from your action, which is in a way to say disown the action that you're actually doing, because there is a higher will that is making you do it. Did I get that right?
Not really, but but if you just tell
Okay.
me which words in which paragraph, if you read it out, then that's clearer for me to
Okay, so this
understand the
is
context.
page 36,
Yes,
and the main paragraph, the middle paragraph, and this is where it is said, it's actually, it links up with what the previous question was about equality, etc. But the point that I'm finding difficult to kind of resolve in my own mind is the fact that the Gita is telling us
yes.
Tina, you have gone
Hello?
out. Anything?
Sorry?
that there is a higher will that is making you do it. You
Mm.
are the instrument doing it. Okay.
Okay.
Now, then how can man be held responsible for either a good karma or a bad karma? Because ultimately, something else, some bigger power, higher power, is actually determining it. So I'm finding that very problematic,
Yes,
Amrita.
I understand. I quite understand your question. It's a very good question, and
Mm,
it is problematic because it is not meant for it is meant you see, he's now put this in a chapter called the core of the teaching.
right.
Now, he himself keeps saying that these are gradations and these are grades. It's like you cannot get to this point without having doing a lot of preliminary purification and developing a certain consciousness. So
Okay.
it requires a very uh, what should I say? It requires a lot of work, and
Mm,
before one can even begin to talk like that or think like that.
true.
So that's why he keeps saying that you see, the equality which the Gita preaches is not disinterestedness. The
Mm,
great command to Arjuna given after the foundation is
mm,
arise, slay thy energy, enjoy, slay thy enemies, enjoy a prosperous kingdom, has
mm,
not the ring of an uncompromising altruism or of a dispassionate abnegation. It is
mm,
a state of inner poise and wideness which is the foundation of spiritual freedom. So, with that poise or samatha or equality, poise in that freedom, we have to do the work that is to be done. A
mm,
phrase which the Gita uses with the greatest wideness, including in it all works and so on. Now, what
mm,
is the work to be done is not to be determined by the individual choice, nor is the right to action and the rejection of claim to the fruit, the great
mm.
word of the Gita, and so on. So, where is the problematic statement that you have read? If you read it exactly, I'll tell you exactly how it's supposed to be interpreted.
Therefore, this is towards the end of the same paragraph, maybe the
Okay,
fifth
therefore,
line.
the right to
Therefore, the
action
right to action. Yeah,
is an
that one.
idea,
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
which is only valid so long
yes.
as we are still under the illusion of being the doer. So, what he's saying is, as long as we are governed
Mm,
by the ego consciousness that I
right.
am doing, as long as one is in that consciousness, the
Yeah.
right to action is absolutely valid. You
Okay.
cannot then say, oh, I am not doing the action. Higher consciousness is doing the action.
Right.
Therefore, whatever I do, I'm not subject to any kind of inquiry, right or wrong, morality, ethics. I can go ahead tomorrow and murder,
Right.
XYZ or rob,
Exactly.
ABC, and
Mm,
nothing will happen. I'm not to be held accountable because I'm
yeah.
working because I've got a higher divine inspiration guiding my action. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
That is exactly what he's saying. It is not that. So
Okay.
what is it?
What is
So
it?
you got it. So what is it? It's an idea which is only valid.
Mm,
The right to action is an idea that is only valid. See, he writes it in the opposite way. This is the Sri Aurobindo's language. What he's trying to say is that
okay.
as long as you're living in the normal, ordinary human consciousness and
Right.
have not transformed,
Mm,
purified, and got out of the ego,
mm.
this right to action is absolutely valid. Okay? You will
Okay.
have to be accountable every action. You will need to be duty bound to the
Correct.
moral laws of society and the ethical norms of society. So you cannot then escape it or pretend that you are, or be so irresponsible to say that I will not do it. Yeah.
Mm,
But
mm,
but soon as you have decided and you are on the path
mm,
of you, this changes, but it changes not through the mind, not through something that you instruct the mind, but
mm.
through the movement forward, the divine
Okay.
consciousness that brings a complete reversal of the ego consciousness and the human
Okay.
consciousness to the divine. So the ego goes behind, the divine consciousness
Um,
comes forward. There's a wideness and a great, what should I say, change of consciousness that takes place. And
mm.
then you begin to govern yourself from higher laws. Only then. And it takes
Eh,
a long time. Okay?
yes. Yes. Maybe that's where I'm stumbling a little because
Please.
I can sense the logic in what you've just said, but I'm not able to still kind of completely resolve it in my mind. It's still a kind of a question mark. Well, let
So
me ponder over it, Amita. I think it
I
will
think
take a
so.
while.
I think
Hmm.
leave it for the time being. It is
Yeah,
not, the mind cannot grapple with it because the
yeah,
mind is 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 a consciousness that is steeped in the ego.
right,
But let it stay with you and
right,
meditate on it
yeah,
and let it just without any judgment. We'll see maybe over time some glimpse of
yeah,
nation may
right.
come, or you may decide at this point that that is something that is beyond your acceptance.
Understanding.
Just pick
Yeah,
which
yeah.
one.
Possible. Yes. Thank you.
Amita, may I just say one word?
Yes.
Amita, while I was studying this chapter, I think what clearly one core aspect changed the entire, it made the understanding very uh, easy in
Hmm.
today's session.
Hmm.
Even though there was some human effort being made in understanding the summary, but the part is that Sri Aurobindo talks about what is Gita beyond moral ethics, beyond Prakriti, beyond duty, beyond social. But the key that I understood after today's session is that to understand the beyond, you have to firstly go beyond your own state of consciousness
Hmm.
to understand the core of the teaching.
Hmm.
So thanks a lot for making it so much easier to now understand holistically. So
Right.
this is the key point that I understood today. It
Okay.
made the threads become very clear.
Hmm. Good. Right. So shall we end now
Mm.
with some meditation?